live. Yes, hello everybody. We are live. Happy Friday. Happy Friday to all of our friends in the data protection, tech policy, privacy, or whatever you're doing here on LinkedIn world. I'm delighted to be joined today by David Sallay, who leads our youth and education work. That means supporting schools, K to 12 and beyond, on how they can navigate using apps, how to use different service providers, all the different technology that is today in the classroom, helping edtech companies understand that they've got strict obligations when they do serve schools, and policymakers understand this complicated world. This is not just a world of youth and teens. It's a world that is regulated by FERPA and COPPA and state student privacy laws that cover schools and state student privacy laws that cover vendors and companies that are signing on to standardized contracts and people who've signed the FPF student privacy pledge. And of course, all the other rules that govern how teachers and students and parents act in schools. So welcome to you all, and thanks for joining me. David. David comes from, David's now been with us a couple of years already. How long?
Year and a half.
Year and a half. Spent a good chunk of his career previously at the Department of Education in the state of Utah, and so had a lot of experience on that side of the table. He and the team have put together a report that is going to be out just a couple of days, sometime next week, and the report is called Vetting Generative AI Tools for Use in Schools. Now, we know that there is a debate about whether and how and if Gen AI ought to be used in schools, but the reality is teachers are using it for their lesson plans. Students are using it one way or another. AI is one of the tools that is available, easy, cheap, free. You can't tell students not to Google the answers to things or not to do research by looking up stuff online. We need to understand, and they need to understand. And in fact, today is National AI Literacy Day effort kicked off by a number of groups that are focused on how AI is used in schools. And so very timely that we'll be providing a little bit of support for literacy. So David, why, we're not really telling teachers here, they're the ones who are in charge of pedagogy, schools, teachers, state departments of education. Yeah. Obviously, many of them think that there's clear opportunity here. Others maybe are more skeptical. What are we trying to do here beyond sort of the debate about, just whether Gen AI is appropriate for education?
Yeah, good question. Thanks, Jules. So AI has obviously, it's been in schools for some time in a variety of applications, but we definitely saw really in the past year or so, I'd say, with ChatGPT especially coming onto the scene, and then all these stories as you mentioned of like students using it to cheat, then using AI, teachers using AI on the other side to figure out if students are using it to cheat. And basically we've had a lot of schools say, at first they said, we don't think that students should be using this, let's block it. But more recently, I think schools have realized this isn't going away. Our role should be educating and preparing students for the future. We think this is going to have a part in the future. So let's allow it, but let's start passing policies and procedures for using it safely. And we were taking a look at the guidance, and several states have already put out broader guidance that does cover a lot of the pedagogy and other things like that. And really noticed that when it came to privacy, what it would typically just say is things like, make sure you are using the tool in alignment with FERPA. Or maybe adding the state laws, maybe adding some of the other ones you mentioned. And that's about all that these larger guidance documents have been saying. Well, my view is FERPA is turning 50 this August. Wow. When it was originally passed, I don't think Congress, they were thinking about Watergate. They were not thinking about AI. AI, when FERPA was passed, was it was pure science fiction, right? Like 2001: A Space Odyssey was probably like a good example that they would have had in their minds. So my thinking was very much that, like, well, this law, and we have some newer state laws that were passed in the past 10 years that regulate ed tech in general. Even in the past 10 years, this has changed so much. It's changed so much in the past year that what is really needed is more detail than just say, hey, figure out how to apply these old laws to this new technology. So we're really trying to fill in that gap and say, well, here are the things that are different, here are the things that are unique, and how they would fit and apply to the existing laws.
For the folks who are not deep into sort of ed in schools, what are the kinds, just to give a flavor? I mean, I mentioned, and you mentioned sort of teachers using it for lesson plans, or teachers using tools to know, is there plagiarism involved and so forth. I know we have seen over the years AI uses, personalized tutors and personalized learning, and presumably Gen AI is playing a role in making some of those tools more personalized, more sophisticated. People maybe have seen, Khan Academy, which has long had walking students through how to do a math problem, now using Gen AI in their Kanemoto, or I forget exactly what it's called. Kanamigo.
Yeah.
So Khan Academy, your friend, Kanamigo,
right.
to have a more personalized back and forth, I guess, with the student. What are the other kinds of things that are relevant, or maybe create a video clip, or prepare a PowerPoint, and instead of running around to get the images from free clip art sites, generating it? Or are there some examples of what we see teachers or students or even school systems using Gen AI for?
Yeah, so I break it into three larger categories. So there's you hit on a couple, certainly that are very student focused. And one of the big commercial uses or proposed uses, we're seeing more of these being rolled out by different companies, is that kind of personalized co-pilot or tutor that the student, there'll be a text box and they can enter in information and be like, hey, I want help with my math. And, ideally, and, it'll walk you through the steps the same as a human tutor would. And have some opportunity for personalizing it, where you can say, like, I don't really understand that. Can you like give me a different example? Or, you can interact with it in ways similar to what you could do with a human, but that more traditional ed tech tools where, there'd be not a large text box. It would be input. You put in a number and it'd be like right answer, wrong answer. That's all it could do. But obviously there's lots of other instances where students can have it in front of them. I think of a lot of creativity tools, like creating, I don't want to like call out too many companies by name, but I've seen the commercials with Adobe where, you can type in the text and it will generate images for you. And then you can put those into the art or whatever it is you're creating. Coding also has lots of applications where, like they could type in, this is what I need some Python script to do, for example, and it would shoot it out in Python. And, a teacher could use that for lots of things, right? To compare against and whatnot. There's lots of applications for teachers as well, again, ranging from very non-personal things like, giving ideas to design your landing page for your learning management system site, which is where a student and parent might go to interact with the teacher, to very personal things, time saver kind of things, where I've seen some versions that, and these are the things that concern me a little, where it's like, oh, if I could just enter in my students' data here and it will analyze it for me and it will save me time in grading the paper. Or we already hit on the example of, like if I put in a student's paper here, will this program come out and tell me, was this plagiarized?
But I think we want to caution teachers,
yes.
Given that it's AI Literacy Day. I've been hearing from lawyers and parents who said that their student has had a paper flagged for plagiarism, either with Turnitin or with some other tool, And these are not just like we want to be advising students in terms of literacy, like this is not an accurate tool. It might be useful, but you got to use it with some caution and directionally, and be wary that these things hallucinate, and here's how they work. They're not mathematical computing. They are statistical probability of this is probably what the rest of the sentence ought to look like, but that's maybe built on a lot of Reddit data, and people talk a lot of trash there, right? So teachers, students, and maybe if you're a parent and you don't believe your kid because the teacher said that they've got evidence and it's from Turnitin or one of these tools, don't rely. I mean, if that's your clue, and then you want to go look more closely and take a harder look at the paper, that's one thing. But to be using this technology to convict, condemn, suspend, take action adverse to a student, you're making the biggest mistake possible given the state of accuracy of these tools. So,
yeah. I definitely agree. And before being at the state board in Utah and working on privacy, I was a teacher. I was a writing teacher, oddly enough. I worked in Qatar at the university there in the Persian Gulf. And that was, 15 years ago when I was there. But like students were cheating on writing all the time. There it was, they were wealthy and they would pay somebody to write it for them. And now you've got something that will write it for you and you don't have to pay for it. So like the barrier to entry for cheating is certainly lower. But at the same time, I think you're exactly right where, we would, back then, I think this was even pre-Turnitin, but like if I knew my students writing, it'd be like, this doesn't sound like something they'd write. This all of a sudden sounds really, really well written, or just like not their voice whatsoever. And I would Google it and see like, well, did they copy it from Google somewhere? But, basically the proof was in the pudding. I would try and find like, well, where did this come from? If it was just a number that statistically said, yeah, this was likely cheating. Oh, bless you. I think that would be, again, I would heavily caution knowing that like, this is a student's, a scholarship might be on the line. If you're basing it on this, their whole like career, academic future, there's major stakes for the student. And like, how certain are you when you're just getting like statistically a number versus like, I would at least try and see to be able to show the student where it's like, look, like here is like copy and pasted from the internet. I know you took it from exactly here. So again, like some utility, but we got to ask ourselves, particularly when there's a big risk of ruining a child or an adult student's future, like what is fair, knowing again that there's very concerning accuracy issues with the technology as it currently stands.
Well, we all made fun of that lawyer who infamously filed, a legal brief written by ChatGPT, and it made up cases and made up citations, and we're all like, come on, you're a lawyer, shouldn't you be sophisticated and know better? But there are university professors, frankly, who seem to be not knowing better. So a caution and warning. All right. Well, let's turn to the data protection issues. When we first talked about this a number of months ago, I recall your initial reaction being, well, leaving aside sort of the content IP issues, which are significant but are not really our core expertise. We're looking at the data protection issues. So, well, this is just using a service provider, public and free one, which we know we've always said, hey, you can't point students to general commercial sites. Go use the public version of anything, because these are often ad supported, data supported, and all that. And if these are vendors providing services to schools, then we have a framework, around that. And, so it's really in large part a matter of applying FERPA, COPPA, and all the usual rules, but with some twists, because obviously the Gen AI has some complications that might, warrant us walking through how FERPA applies, how COPPA applies. A lot of these services say, hey, we don't use any personal information. Well, let's look a little bit, harder at that. So in the report, you really walk through what I think are the key topics that we would be walking any AI application through, but with an ear towards some of the nuances that are unique when it comes to AI, or particularly Gen AI. So I think you started with a flag that these are very use case dependent. Gen AI takes maybe a lot of user input, compared to maybe specific tools. So give a little more detail of what you were flagging with the use case dependent point.
Yes, certainly. So I think we wrote this really trying to take the seat of like when I was in my old job, or someone who is reviewing the tool, what do they need to know? And typically, I would start at the very beginning where it's like, well, what is the data it's collecting? And then what is it going to do with it? And just knowing the way these tools are, we're very often, particularly generative AI, where it's a text box and you can put anything in there and it will produce output. And that input might include student data that's protected. The output might also be considered protected data. And that's one very key difference compared to, again, just giving that example of a traditional math ed tech tool or something with multiple choice, much more limited on the inputs. And so I think that would be one of the first things. I wouldn't just want to know, well, what is the tool you want to use? I need to know, what is the use case? Because this tool can essentially do anything you tell it to. So I would want to understand, well, teacher, are you going to be using it for this? Because certain use cases I think are very benign. Some of them are very unlikely to require student data. Other ones might have a definite creepy factor, things we've talked about with plagiarism. But I think, any kind of substantive decision, such as enrollments being a really good example. It's like, I'm going to put in a bunch of personal information about applicants or students and have it come out and tell me, the right answer that, again, could have a major impact on the individual's life. So that's what I mean with the use case dependency. I'd want to know just not what is the tool, but also what does the tool do? What are you going to use it for? Try and get a sense of what the data inputs and outputs will be, so that I could then determine whether those are, not covered by these laws, because a lot of them, frankly, are not going to be personal. A teacher wanting to, get help with lesson plans. That's a good example I've heard, where it's like, I need to cover this, and I have the state standards here, and maybe some third thing I want to be able to do. Can you come up, amalgamate all this information, and on the other end, tell me like what I should teach Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday of this week? I don't think that that's likely to trigger too many issues. There's not personal information on the input or output, but there's a lot where it will. And that's where it's like, okay, I'd want to know what it is, put the protections in place, and then be able to use it.
Yeah, and certainly, even on the teacher side, a teacher may be creating an account that might be necessary. I think we already stated that if the teacher is going to use a, free commercial version, or even the, paid versions of some of these tools, be well aware that those are always almost problematic, because if you are not using a tool designed for school service with the appropriate limitations, there's very little likelihood that that policy has been crafted with the kind of limitations, that are needed. So again, beware the free stuff, beware even the paid stuff. If your school has a license or so forth, that might be the best place to go. If it doesn't, then you really have a careful job to do, maybe using the paid version, but perhaps selecting the options, and even there, whether or not that model's promise of how it does or doesn't use the data you've entered. Okay, but it may be the teacher's data, and as you know, that's the FERPA is covering the student's data. So beware, teacher, you may be giving away your, information about your lesson planning or so on and so forth, to help improve a model that may or may not be, okay with you. There might be other laws that are relevant, but it might not involve student data. So big first question, which is, I think, a little complicated with some of the Gen AI, is there student personal information involved? And then FERPA, again, being a little more limited, although some of the state laws being a little broader, FERPA, regulating the school's use of a student record, which isn't necessarily everything that a student does or creates, although many things.
Yeah.
And then student privacy laws at the state level that very often went much more broader and included student personal information. So one of the kind of complexities with Gen AI is obviously a student can write in, personal information, can have an account and information linked to them with regard to some of their work, is or some of the things they're asking, might be very well covered. And then you have this weird reality that these tools claim that they themselves don't contain personal information in their models, but yet they're able to spit out quote unquote personal information, which might end up then being, covered. So you do need to be careful in your analysis. You also note a lot of these are, building their answer, their prompt is the student input. And so you don't necessarily have a lot of control over what the student puts in. The student might be loading in, their previous test scores or things that are, very much covered. Hey, predict what I'm going to get on the next paper, or here are my last 5 papers, write me the 6th paper. And so you may not, you probably need to anticipate that a tool with an open box is whether or not you think it's collecting personal information. The students may be entering FERPA covered data or state student covered data.
Right, exactly. And just to add on to that thought, like that has been like the main privacy guidance I've heard so far is just to say, don't enter personal information. Again, like if you've worked with teenagers, if you tell them don't enter anything personal, okay, now let's get to work. There's going to be some student who is going to enter something overtly personal, probably about someone in the class. Maybe they won't do it for themselves, but it's like, I'm going to pretend I'm so-and-so. There's always going to be that kind of testing of limits. And so that's one of the things I would say to look out for is, if it has just that open text box and you're putting it in front of a student, there are protections that can be in place. And I think a lot of the companies that are introducing stuff where they know it's going in front of a student, they're limiting exactly the kinds of things that you're talking about, where it's like, if it looks like personal information, we're not going to have that data go into the larger training model, or take those steps to limit it coming out on the output of the tool, because that's also a concern that we've seen, where if you enter stuff and it uses it, it might reproduce it in answers for somebody else, and we also don't want that.
And remind people about PPRA, because everybody in our world knows about FERPA, and yes. Everyone knows about COPPA, and kind of the most underappreciated, even when we were dealing with lots of state legislation and legislators were saying, well, FERPA only does this. And we'd say, yeah, but PPRA covers all. They're like, what, where? The Protection of Pupil Rights Amendment, a federal law that does what?
So the Protection of Pupil Rights Amendment, PPRA, does a couple of things, but what it's best known for is having a list of protected categories that relate to data collection. So this is basically, Congress said these are things that are so sensitive that in specific circumstances, we think you would have to give parents notice and get their consent in order to give them. There are some state laws, for example, in Utah where I worked, we had one that was mirrored the federal law, but was a little stricter, where it said in every circumstance it needs to be parental consent. So just to give an example of what some of these categories are, this would be religion, politics of either the student or like the parents, sexual behavior, criminal behavior, drug behavior, those sorts of things. And this is an example where like we tried as best as we could in this report to just cover like what the actual state of things is. Like this is what the law as currently written, that was not written really thinking about this technology. This is how it would apply. But I think there's still so many cases, and this often happens with PPRA, where I don't want to put schools in a position where there's angry parents saying, how did you let this happen? And then they look at a technicality in the way PPRA is written, where it's like, well, since it wasn't a federally funded survey, it only had to be notice and an opt-out. So that's, I'll note, one of the things when I've played with some of these tools, I try and see, like, can I get it to like have conversations with me about politics, about sex, about religion, the kind of things that you could see like a parent finding out about and then calling the school. And while it might technically not be a violation of PPRA, I think those are the kinds of things someone reviewing it would want to be thoughtful of before recommending it be used in the whole school. And I would also hope that companies would realize, like, look, if your use case is like you want to have this awesome tool that helps them learn science and math and things, are you taking steps to have it basically say, no, I can't talk about that with you? Like religion, that's beyond the scope of math today.
Now, these models are famous for, using the inputs to learn. That's how they get built in the first place. But there are concerns around how and when school service providers can use student PII for product improvement.
Mm-hmm. And that's nothing new, honestly. That's very similar to like discussions ed tech has been having for quite some time, as long as they've been collecting data. It's just a different flavor of data collection, and one that these tools completely rely on, because again, like you want the inputs, I think particularly in a tutoring tool, to like eventually learn more about the kid to be able to provide them more personalized content. So that's one where, that typically we would say under FERPA, it comes to the question of whether it's de-identified or not. But even state laws have said where it's like, if it's for the specific product, it doesn't even necessarily have to be de-identified. There are some specific states where I believe New York and Florida are ones where they don't explicitly say that. And so those are ones where, if you're in one of those states, I'd want to look at it and say like, okay, company, are you going to be building other products off of this? And if so, like, are the products still at least school products? That seems to be an area where most of the state laws and FERPA would say like this kind of use of having it go into an LLM and or large language model and then use that to develop more educational products, probably fine. But this is also where I think we see COPPA come in. So the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, which typically applies more to the companies than it does to the schools, but makes a caveat regarding parental consent that basically if it is being used entirely in the educational context, then the school can stand in and provide that consent in place of the parent. But if we're starting to do commercial things, so things that, if the company's going to use it to create potentially products that aren't for use in schools, then COPPA, the interpretation I believe the FTC would have is that like, no, in that case, like you have to get parental consent.
In fact, as the report points out, and for those who joined this late, this is a report we'll be releasing in the upcoming week. The recent proposed update to COPPA, which the FTC has not finalized, just taken feedback and comment on, but will be final in some short period of time going forward. It proposes limiting the use of student personal information for improvement to the specific educational service that the school has authorized, right? And as you also noted, the school could provide consent, maybe for something broader, but it would still have to be within the educational context. And again, knowing the kind of model you're working with, is this very general, model perhaps, and it's going to improve the model in general, or even come up with some new, features, maybe not, depending on the applicability of COPPA, the applicability of consent, and then nuances in different student laws. We only have a couple of minutes. Some of the other key points that the report flags are things like, is the tool going to be used for substantive decision making? What do we mean by that?
Yeah, and we hit on that a little bit earlier with like plagiarism, but essentially, like there's nothing in the law that says you can't use data to ruin a student's life in future. But in some cases, we are seeing outside of the student privacy laws, I think AI specific laws, where it is at least starting to identify certain cases. So I could point to, and our analysis was primarily US focused, but the EU AI Act is an example where it's using a risk-based framework. And in its high risk category, it mentions like educational admissions as an example. And we're seeing that in some state laws as well, where they point out where it's like, if you're going to be using this to determine whether a student gets into a school program or not, then, you know, at least you have to have like an opt-out, or maybe in some cases it's outright prohibiting that practice. But again, going back to kind of the plagiarism one, there is nothing in privacy law that is permitting what we are hearing about right now, where like a school could run your paper through software that is very questionable in terms of accuracy, and then basically kick you out of the school. The privacy law doesn't address that at all. But that's one where I, again, really caution, you know, I think as we were saying before, it's like that might be a helpful point of evidence. But, you know, for me, when I was doing the job, I always had to find like the proof in the pudding. Like, you know, can I demonstrate more than just this thing that indicates maybe? You know, I'd use it as maybe one point among many. But, you know, definitely want to be careful and always asking ourselves like, hey, well, I think another example we talked about in the report was mental health apps, knowing that, you know, mental health is a big issue with youth nowadays, as well as like funding for school nurses is, you know, or guidance counselors, people they can talk to is lower. So if a school was looking and saying, hey, like maybe let's use this as a solution where if the kid's having a hard time, they can talk to a computer about it, because we can't afford to have an adult do it. I mean, we've seen examples of software already that is given like horrific advice. You know, I think the example we reference in the report is, you know, where it basically gave the teenager advice that was tantamount to them telling them to develop an eating disorder. Those kinds of things where, you know, like going back to the like, oh, the design for my classroom homepage or lesson plans, you know, helping assist with that. Those are like, if it's a little inaccurate, it's not going to have as much of an impact as some other things. And even though, again, the law doesn't directly say it in many cases, I think we are going to see more laws that are going to be taking this risk-based approach and saying, it's really high risk. You need to do some kind of an assessment. You need to like demonstrate that the pros outweigh the cons.
You know, one example that was also flagged in the document, and to respond to Shilpi Agarwal, who says, where can you find the report? Couple of days, we'll post it on our website. We'll post it on Student Privacy Compass, where we put out a lot of our student oriented material, and I'll post it here as well as David and team on the FPF page. So give us a couple of days. We're going to get it out next week. I get asked to write letters of recommendation, letters of reference all the time. Obviously, lots of teachers and high school guidance counselors and college professors. And I kind of get the attraction of letting a tool do that draft for me so I can just tweak it. But a Stanford University study that we flag in the report here notes that some of these letters were written by AI tools in ways that discriminated against women. I don't know if that meant that, you know, they didn't write as strong a letter based on, you know, perusing the resume, or, you know, what led to that bias. But, you know, even if you're doing something that maybe seems like, you know, hey, this is a safe use, recognizing that all of the data in the world, which is what has created these models, means all the messy, contradictory, biased, nasty, ugly data in the world. And somehow, you know, it's pretty good in certain use cases with lots of training and lots of work, but not there yet for, as magically good it is in some cases, it's surprisingly insidiously bad. Really bad is maybe easy, right? Like, don't give eating disorder advice. It's these subtle things that maybe look good and, hey, it wrote a nice letter, but you just don't realize that it's writing a more effective letter, you know, for others, and you are introducing a real negative outcome. Anyway, stay tuned for the report. I'll close with referencing Manal Khan, who says students shouldn't be so dependent on AI. It will devastate their IQ level. Look, there's a generation that's grown up. I don't know numbers anymore. They're in my phone. I used to know all my friends' numbers, family's numbers. I barely know my kids' numbers. It's in my phone, and my brain doesn't remember 7-digit numbers the way it once did. We don't have the ability to navigate because we rely on maps. We Google things, and how we can ensure that students still build those critical thinking skills and use technology in a literate and effective way, as opposed to, become dependent on it as a crutch. Well, that's for the teachers and educators of the world to help figure out. We simply want to help make sure these tools are safe enough for you to consider using when you do assess them to be useful for certain purposes. And I'm hoping that this report will be valuable to all of the folks who are enthusiastic, and for those who are less enthusiastic, a good way to really assess more clearly what some of the harms are. So David, thanks to you and the team. Stay tuned for the report, and we will wish the rest of you a happy Friday. Let me just remind you that if you're in the DC area or willing to travel, on June the 5th, we are doing an AI day, really focused on all of the deep, complicated aspects of AI and data protection. It's free. Take a look at our website under events to join us, and we hope you can on the 5th. And David will be talking about this report there, as well as lots of other experts from the outside world, as well as from our team, on some of the interesting topics that are critical to everyone who is interested in the future of AI. Thanks, everybody. Happy Friday. Good to be with you.
Thanks,
David.